Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes. And with me is my fellow traveller in the existential realm, Mr. Ken Kelly. How's your existential self, Ken?
Oh, the existential realm is particularly nice at the moment. We make this from the United Kingdom and we've got some sun. Yes.
Yeah, we can see the sun. It's come out. It's great. There's people in the street literally pointing with their children at it going, "What's that, mummy?" It's the sun.
Taking pictures of the mythical yellow ball in the sky.
Yeah, I remember if you see the sun, don't look at it. It's not really good for your eyes. Health and safety warning.
The Counselling Tutor Podcast is good for your studies, and we've got an absolutely action-packed episode for you today. I think you're going to like this. We're going to be kicking off with a little bit of a debate about what self-actualisation is. This comes from our Facebook group, so we're going to be looking at that. Going into theory with Rory, and this is a treat for you. This is, when I was one of Rory's students, this was one of my favourite lessons. It's all around ethical problem solving, and there's a not to be missed giveaway with this one as well that you will use no matter what level you're at. If you're a learner, you'll use it. And when you're in practice and you've been in practice for 10 years, you'll still be using it. So that's still to come. See what I'm doing? I'm putting a hook out there and getting everybody excited.
You're being a fisherman, Ken, aren't you? You're doing your fishing, aren't you?
We're going into part 2 of the 7 stages of process. If you missed part 1, it's in last week's episode. Go and pick up on that one. And then we're going to go into Ask Ken and Rory, where we're going to be looking at what the difference is between counselling and psychotherapy.
Ooh.
But we're going to kick off as we generally do with this is, I guess today, it's an integrative questions, because we've taken a little bit from different posts within our Facebook group. If you're not part of our Facebook group, come and join us. How do you find us? Go on Facebook and put in the words Counselling Tutor, and you're going to find us. It's the Counselling Tutor Facebook group, and we'll let you in, and you can come and join over 1,500 other learners, tutors, and practicing therapists from around the world, and come and join in the debate. But the question is around self-actualisation, of what that is, and kind of how it works, and how you would, I guess, put this in an assignment. What can you put? So handing over to you, Rory, on self-actualisation.
Well, I'm going to self-actualise myself here. And I think self-actualisation, it's a term that's kind of bandied around a lot. And sometimes it's assigned to Abraham Maslow, and sometimes it's assigned to Carl Rogers, and sometimes it's just something that's talked about in the human potential movement. And I think the way to start this, or the way to look at it, is the fundamental basis of humanistic approaches. And that is, it's a growth model. It's a model where it's inside out, where we make decisions internally and grow. And we can only do that, according to people like Abraham Maslow, if certain things are in place. So just as a kind of observation, I worked in a hostel for people who'd come out of prison for a few years. And one of the things was that unless people had stability in their life, unless they had somewhere to sleep and they had food, they really couldn't progress their lives on. You know, there are some remarkable people who could sleep on the street and live hand to mouth and still do PhDs in astrophysics, but they're very few and far between. So if we're thinking of self-actualisation, it's about having the very basis of existence in place before we can move to the next level. And Maslow developed a triangle, didn't he, Ken?
He did.
He developed a triangle that helps us understand what is needed for people to grow. And this is particularly prevalent in the UK at the moment with the age of austerity we're going through. So basically, he had a number of steps. So we're thinking of a triangle, and at the base of the triangle, which is the wide base, we're talking about the needs which are physiological. Now, I'll ask you a question, Ken. What is it you need right here, right now to survive?
Well, I think I heard, and I think this was by Bear Grylls. Bear Grylls said
Yes.
that there is the rule of 3, and I think it's that you can live for 3 minutes without air.
Yes.
You can live for 3 days without water, and you can live for 3 weeks without food.
Yes. You're
and
right.
Those are them. Those are them right at the bottom. Without air, food, water, we're not here. So that is our primary drive. It's an instinctive drive. And if you want to see why this base of Maslow's triangle is air, shelter, water, food, all you need to do is look at a national disaster. A national disaster brings people back to that base of the triangle where it is a scramble just to get clean drinking water and food to eat, and the world comes and brings in the humanitarian aid. That's what they bring in there because they are those basic needs.
Absolutely, Ken. And the thing is, he's absolutely right, these Bear Grylls. You can't swap them over. They're not interchangeable. So you can't say, well, I'll swap air for water.
No.
I'll swap water for food. It doesn't work like that. So right at the bottom of the pyramid is breathing, water, food. Homeostasis, which is basically about getting your needs met physiologically, and that includes going to the loo, believe it or not,
Yep.
and sleep.
Yes.
And in some parts of the triangle, sex. And I'll make the difference between sex and intimate relationships. Sex is seen as in the triangle as a biological function as opposed to a kind of loving, intimate space between two people. So those have to be in place before a person can then go on to the next level of the triangle, which is safety. And safety is, we'd say contemporary society is about living in somewhere safe, just in your neighbourhood. You know, you can't, if you're locked in your house because there's people running riot around you, you don't feel safe, you feel scared, you can't go out to the shops, you can't go and meet friends. So the second is safety. And again, it really goes back to when I worked in a hostel where you couldn't get anybody to do anything or reclaim their lives because if they didn't feel safe, they just couldn't go out. They couldn't do anything. And it happens with clients as well, doesn't it? How often do we meet clients occasionally, Ken, who just don't feel safe in the world?
Yeah, 100% is very prevalent, I guess, to what we do as therapists to provide or aim to provide that safe environment. And I think, so we're looking at that first self-actualization. You're not going to be concerned or worried about your safety and your security unless those base needs are met of that food, that shelter. So those base needs, once they are met, then you can self-actualize, in other words, move on to thinking about other things. And that second base, safety, security.
Absolutely. And the next thing, this is really where we as therapists get involved with clients. We don't usually get really involved with physiological needs or safety needs, but certainly in the next part of the triangle, which is love and belonging, which is things like companionship, knowing people, as Nietzsche said, being known and knowing others, family, which is something we wouldn't get involved in as a therapy, and sexual intimacy. So the idea is that now we're making connections with people, and people are connecting with each other, knowing each other, and feeling that they're part of the world, Ken.
And you won't need to look far within your therapy practice room to hear that is often brought in. People not feeling that those needs are met for them, that they're having a struggle or a fraction within their family, that they don't feel that they are accepted by peers. It is often a need that is brought into the therapy room. So something that we'll be working on, I guess, a lot as therapists. Yeah.
And then we move to the next part of the triangle, which is called esteem. And this is really where we as therapists work. It's about confidence, respecting self, maybe respecting others, self-esteem, loving one's self. And that is about being happy with oneself. So people can function in the bottom three of those blocks quite easily, but they don't have a fulfilled existence unless they know people and feel confident in people thinking a lot of them and thinking a lot of themselves. And I guess as an educator, Ken, this is where education plays a primary role.
Yep.
People succeeding in their studies, the people, you guys listening out there,
yep.
Doing in your studies, it'll boost your self-esteem. Look, I've got this qualification. Look, I'm doing this. And this is really important for people to have a healthy psychological life. And then finally, we go to what Maslow calls self-actualization. And here we have a little bit of a debate, Ken.
We do.
When when Maslow made the triangle, he actually stated there was only 3 people in the world that had self-actualized, and one of them I think was Gandhi, and one of them was the wife of a president. I think it was Eleanor Eisenhower. Most modern people modern thinkers looking at the triangle would say actually that if you have to cut the top off, and self-actualization goes on forever.
I agree.
It's one of those things that we come along and what self-actualization is basically what Rogers was talking about. See how I did that, Ken?
Yeah, you've brought this back to that key question of what is self-actualization.
Yeah. I've read a book or two as well. It's amazing. Yeah, I've brought it back. And Rogers talks about, and I know you're going to be talking about it, this idea of what we call sometimes the core conditions of being non-judgmental. And non-judgmental isn't just about being non-judgmental of others. It's about non-judgmental of yourself, of being accepting of facts, having a lack of prejudice, being spontaneous, being creative, being a moral person. And that means just doing the right thing. And that's the top of the triangle. When people are there, the theory would tell us that we are fully functioning. We are fully functioning people. And sometimes this triangle, the path up from this triangle is done through faith position, people of faith, through their religious or faith position ideas. Sometimes it's done through personal development in counselling. There's lots of paths to it, but the theory would tell us that if we get to that part, then we're fully functioning people.
It really is interesting, and self-actualization, as I understand Rogers' definition of that, is kind of when we move from one place to another place, from that rigidity to that fluidity, and that constant movement is us self-actualizing. And if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have a look at that triangle. The one thing to keep in mind is that this is not a linear one-way journey. You can go from the top of the triangle where you'd be looking at things like creativity and problem solving right back down to the very bottom. If again there's a natural disaster, you're not going to be worrying about whether your artistic impersonation or impression of a statue you're making is 100% right. If there's a disaster and you need food and water and air, you're right back down there again.
It's very true. And a few years ago, there was a disaster, and counsellors volunteered to go over to help people with stress or post-traumatic stress. And you know what they ended up doing, Ken, the counsellors?
Handing out food and water, Rory?
Yes, strangely enough, yes.
Exactly.
And they ended up carrying water buckets and slopping out latrines and that type of thing, because without the basics in place, then nothing else would work. And it was a bit of a salutary lesson for them. So that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the other thing to put in context was Maslow and Rogers and the human potential movement, which was formed by thinkers in the 1960s who were developing humanism, and Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World and Doors of Perception and that type of thing. He was one of the founders of the human potential movement. So they all had an input. So when we're thinking of Rogers' work, a lot of people think, well, Rogers did it all himself. Actually, he had a lot of help. And he took a lot of bits from a lot of people, Ken.
Great information, a great question, I guess, and hopefully you've got something out of that. And again, this section of the podcast is about Rory and I having a bit of a debate and a ramble about it. And we encourage you to debate this and talk about it in your learning institutions, with your peers, with your friends, because it's an interesting debate and I think one definitely worth having. So we're going to be moving now on swiftly to theory with Rory. And this is the one that I kind of sowed that seed in the beginning that is going to be well worthwhile. You are actually going to love this. You're going to be looking at ethical problem solving today, Rory. And I know that, this is part of being a counsellor. We have our ethics and we're going to have problems. So ethical problem solving, you're going to sit down one day with a dilemma and need to solve this problem.
Absolutely, Ken. And what we have to be aware of is the BACP ethical framework. It changes, I think, in July. And they will ask you to make defensible decisions. And I'm going to be talking in theory with Rory, defensible decision making. In other words, when someone said, why did he take that path of thinking to deal with that particular an ethical dilemma, you can sit and say, this is what I've done, this is how I've done it, and this is how I've thought it through. And it's going to be an ethical imperative. So I'm going to be giving away free my ethical problem solving grid. I'm going to be giving away free the grid that I use and the decision-making pathway that I use and teach my students.
Very relevant, and specifically with you mentioning the new ethical framework, which is coming in just a short a few months from when we're making this recording. Of course, if you're listening to it in the future, it may well be in already. But a great influencer and writer of the new ethical framework is Professor Tim Bond. And what Rory is talking about giving away is actually Tim Bond's ethical problem-solving matrix. Let's go and listen to Theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees Oakes.
On the 1st of July 2016, the BACP will release and expect practitioners to abide by a new code of ethics. Part of that code of ethics is going to ask us to consider how we respond to ethical dilemmas, and those are covered in Articles 76, 77 and 78 of the new ethical framework. The framework tells us we recognise that professional and ethical issues, problems and dilemmas will arise from time to time and are an unavoidable part of our practice. We will use supervision and any other available professional resources to support and challenge how we respond to such situations, and we will give careful consideration to the best approaches to ethical problem solving. We will take responsibility for considering how best to act in such situations, and we will be ready to explain why we've decided to act in the way we did. And that brings us to something that's been prevalent in a lot of services and a lot of social services for quite a long time: defensible decision making. In other words, if you make a decision, then you're going to have to supply the reasons and the route you took to make that decision. And indeed, in Article 77 of the new framework, it talks about we will give careful consideration to the best approaches to ethical problem solving. And in Article 78, be ready to explain why we decided to respond the way we did. So how do we do that? Well, we can use supervision. Supervision is a useful tool for helping us with ethical decisions. However, it's not always on tap. It's not always available. We can certainly phone the BACP up, if you remember, or any of your ethical bodies, and they should have a unit that talks about ethics. You should be able to talk to them, but maybe that's not always available. So what is it that we fall back on when effectively we find ourselves on our own and wanting to make an ethical decision? Well, some people would fall back onto an ethical problem-solving grid, and I'm going to go through the ethical problem-solving grid that I was taught as a student and that I teach my students. And it's a 6-step process, and it was developed by Professor Tim Bond, who coincidentally has authored the new ethical framework. So we can see that there's a good pedigree in this problem-solving grid, and I'm going to take you through it. It's 6 steps, and I'm going to talk about the first step. And the first step is to produce a brief description of the problem or dilemma. Now, I would recommend that if you're going to produce a description of your problem or your dilemma, write it down. Don't type it or think it in your head. Physically get a pen, if you're able to, and write it down. And the reason for that is it's a bit of a peculiarity of the human condition, I find. That if you write something down, you kind of become more connected to it. At least that's my experience. So write it down. Write what the problem is. And once you've done that, you go on to the second part of the ethical dilemma grid, which is whose dilemma is it? So your choices here are between the client, the counsellor, which is yourself, or the client and the counsellor. Now, once you've decided whose problem it is, you might be able to stop right there. If it's the client's problem and only the client's problem, then maybe the client can sort it out for themselves. It may be both of yours problems, client and the counsellor. Say a client says they're going to commit suicide. That immediately becomes the client's problem and also yours. So find out whose problem it is. At that point, you can make a decision whether to complete the grid, or to say, well, actually, I made a decision now based on what I know. So if you need to continue, go to section 3. Consider all the available ethical principles and guidelines. So the first thing to think about is what codes of standards are available to you. So first of all, what does the ethical framework say? And what does your policies and procedures of your organisation state? And once you've understood that, then that gives you a better handle on the way to proceed. You could also consider, what, if anything, does the law dictate? What actions are prohibited? What can't you do? What are you not allowed to do? What actions are required? And what are the people involved in entitled by law? In other words, what does the law say about your actions? What are they entitled to? And areas in this part could be things like data protection. If you're going to have to break confidentiality, then you're going to have to think very carefully about who you speak to and why you speak to, and everybody knows their role in that. In the absence of any other direction, you could fall back on beneficence. Now, that's a wonderful word, and I interpret that as doing the right thing. Being beneficent means trying to do the best, trying to do the right thing. Non-maleficence, well, that's doing no harm. Justice, and justice is an interesting one. I would say justice is doing the right thing, and is it just? Is everybody being served by what you're doing? Is your client being served? Is wider society being served? Is the profession being served by what you're doing? That's what I'm talking about, justice. And finally, what are the people involved entitled to by law? So what are the legal implications of the course of action you're going to take? And what are the people involved in the course of action entitled to by law? Then you identify all courses of action. Now, when I was taught this, my tutor said, write it down, no matter how implausible the course of action is. Even if it sounds completely off the wall, write it down and put it up for consideration. And then what you do is you select the best course of action. So you've come to a course of action and you test it against these 3 ideas. Universality, that's a big word, but it means, would others take the same course of action? Given the dilemma, would you say that other people in your position would do the same thing? So thinking about peers, people who do the same kind of work as you, would you do the same thing? Publicity, now this is an interesting one. If there's a complaint made and what your course of action ended up with was being in the papers, so could you justify it to your friends if it ever got into the papers? And also, what about your peers? What about the people that you either train with or serve with in terms of in counselling practice? So publicity is a really useful thing. And one of the ideas could be, say a client left you £1 million, gave you £1 million, and gave you a cheque for £1 million. What would the publicity be on that? What would your peers say? Now, it might be that some peers said take the money and retire. I know that happened when this was put up in my training group many years ago. But it's an interesting idea, isn't it? What would the wider population think, as well as your peers? And also justice, and in this case, justice is, have you done the right thing? And finally, evaluate the outcomes. This is step 6. Was the outcome what you'd have hoped? Have you considered all the relevant factors? And would you do the same thing again? Now, here is an interesting thing. Asking yourself the last question, would you do the same thing again? May be that given the circumstances, you wouldn't. But not all events are the same. There's subtle differences between every ethical dilemma. So that's something to reflect on. And the other thing is that sometimes there's no best solution. Sometimes you have to take a course of action which may be difficult for both you, may be difficult for the client, and it may be difficult for both of you. But if you've gone through the ethical problem solving grid, you have a line of defensible decision making. Well, I hope that's been useful to you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make this available in the downloads, my ethical problem solving grid, and I hope that you never have to use it. But if you do, just remember that the new ethical framework asks us to have not only defensible decision making, but also a process of making that defensible decision.
Really valuable information there. And if you want to get hold of your copy of the Ethical Problem Solving Matrix, you can do that by just heading over to the Counselling Tutor website, which is counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab, go over to podcast 12, that's this episode, and right there in the show notes, you'll be able to download that. Well worth doing. Thank you very much, Rory.
So, Ken, what are we doing in skills? I believe I've asked you a question. I'm asking another question. That's not very good, is it? That's not how we teach counselling. What are you going to be doing in skills today?
Well, we're picking up from last week, and if you missed on that, just again head onto the website and listen to episode 11 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where I covered the first three stages in the 7 stages of process, which keys beautifully, Rory, into how we started off when we were speaking about self-actualisation, as we now go into the remaining 4 stages.
Absolutely, Ken. Anybody would think we actually plan these podcasts.
Counselling Skills with Ken Kelly.
Today we're going to be looking at stages 4, 5, 6 and 7 of Carl Rogers' theory, the 7 stages of process. So if you want to catch up on stages 1 through to 3, then that is available in last week's podcast episode, which is episode number 10. So what are we likely to see at stage 4 in a client's presentation? Well, first of all, we're going to notice that there is once again a loosening of that self-construct. And this is a theme with the 7 stages of process, because it is from that rigidity through to that fluidity. So we're going to be seeing a slight loosening as we go through all of the different stages, I guess. And Carl Rogers refers to this as a gradual loosening of constructs. So what are we looking at now? We're looking that the client is beginning to describe more intense feelings. But these are not feelings again in the here and now. The client is much more comfortable bringing something from the past. Rogers uses a beautiful word here. He calls it the not now present in his book on becoming a person. So we're certainly seeing this client accepting those deeper feelings and bringing them into the therapy room, but more comfortable with that being past tense. So an example of that, I felt so desperately unhappy when she didn't seem to care. And the key word there is I felt. So talking not about I feel here in this present moment, I felt. And then the client may carry on, I've never known such deep feelings. It really scared me. So talking about how the impact and of these massive, overwhelming feelings, but again, not accepting them in this present moment. And it's fully understandable. Those feelings are painful and they're hurtful. Why would the client want to experience them in the here and now? So it's almost like a protection, a barrier of putting that into the past. This client really has a difficulty understanding and accepting these negative feelings within self. They're more likely to want to run away from them. They want to get away from that pain. And I guess putting it in the past is one way of doing that. It's not in the here and now. I don't have to feel it in this room. So an example may be, if this is what falling in love is all about, and this is the hurt I feel from that, then I just don't want to fall in love. It's avoiding the pain at all costs, as opposed to embracing the pain and recognizing that it is part of self. It's almost for this client as if they would rather that pain had never existed in the first place. At stage 4, we're going to notice that the client may accidentally, and there's the strange thing here, accidentally bring here and now feelings into the therapy session. However, if the here and now feeling is brought in, it will generally be mistrusted or rejected entirely by the client. So an example of that is the client may say, oh, there's this deep knot here, right down deep inside, and it stops me from, I guess, being myself, and I don't know what it is, and it makes me angry. What can I do about it? So it's there. It's in the here and now, but it's not accepted, it's not embraced, it's not fully seen as even part of self, the client is trying to distance themselves from it. They're trying to run away from it. They want it to stop. What can I do about it? They're looking for the switch to turn it off. They're looking for the here and now solution to make it stop immediately. At stages 1 to 3, there was a great externalization of why the client was feeling the pain. It was almost like the responsibility for that pain was all from other people, places, and things exerting their will upon the client's life. Here at stage 4, we're going to start to notice that the client is starting to accept the responsibility for what is happening. However, they may accept that responsibility, but the fearfulness of that and the hopelessness of the situation are going to be very apparent. An example of this is the client may say something along the lines of, I'm feeling terrible and I don't know what it is. I've looked around and I just can't find it. It just must be me. There must be something wrong with me. There's a clear indication that there is an acceptance of responsibility, but there is just total helplessness surrounding that. We may find at stage 4 the client has difficulty trusting the therapeutic relationship, trusting the therapist. And this is understandable. They've had difficulty trusting their own feelings. They want to distance themselves from their own feelings. They're having difficulty trusting that they form a part of their world and they are in some way responsible for how their world and how their life has turned out and thus the way they feel. So for them to put trust unquestioningly in the therapist is really, really difficult. And you may hear the client verbalizing that, saying, I find it really difficult to trust people. I don't know if this is going to work for me. How do I know if this is the right modality in counseling for me? How do I know that you're the right counselor? These are clues that we can look for that the client is finding it difficult to trust, and fully understandable if that client is at stage 4. And finally, before we move on to stage 5, we can sometimes see an inappropriate use of humor by the client, where the client may bring pain and a struggle and then put humor with that inappropriately and giggle or laugh. So an example of that is they might bring something really painful and then go, you probably just think I'm mad. Or a great example here is, it's crazy, isn't it? That I can't believe that I keep on getting myself into these situations. Look at me. Third person. Look at me, a man in his 40s acting just like a kid. So kind of distancing themselves from the responsibility and kind of using humor to, again, deflect accepting the feeling fully and embracing it and recognizing it as part of self in the here and now. So that's what we're looking at a client, some clues that you might see to see stage 4 of the 7 stages of process. So how do we work with this client? Well, at this stage 4, the client is beginning to integrate more into the relationship, or although we've already mentioned that not 100% trusting, there is that difficulty in trusting, but the client has a willingness. The client is there. The client is looking at feelings, occasionally bringing them into the present, occasionally using humor to distance themselves because it's painful. It is so painful. This is a great stage, and very often you're going to be working with clients right there at stage 4. What can we do? Just be with them. Just be there. Unconditional positive regard, empathy, being congruent, using your counseling skills. That's all we need to do. We're there to provide a threat-free environment where the client can begin to trust more, can begin to bring more of self, and maybe move on to the 5th stage of the 7 stages of process. As we move into stage 5, I think it's important to point out that this is not a linear process where a client will move from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 and right up to 7. The clients can move between these different stages at any time. It's kind of a fluid motion. And Rogers describes the process when, in other words, what we do with the client and how this works. And I'm going to use his word. If the client feels himself received in his expressions, behaviors, and experiences at the 4th stage, then this sets in motion still further loosening, and the freedom of organismic flow is increased. lovely words of that unconditional positive regard, being there, fully accepting that client, the client feeling fully received, which is the circular point of empathy. Empathy is that we project empathy out, but it is only complete when the client understands that that empathy is there. They feel fully received in a non-judgmental environment. That's what we're there to do. So at stage 5, we're starting to see that this client is more confident about what they're feeling in the here and now. They're happier to express presently experienced feelings. They recognize them as their feelings, and they're more likely to bring them into the therapeutic relationship. There's a deepening, I guess, of the trust, and I guess we say a deepening of the level at which we work, the relational depth. As the client begins to explore bringing these present moment feelings and awarenesses, they are less denied to self and more accepted. As before, there was that running away we saw just at stage 4 and wanting to distance themselves from the feeling. There's more of a, okay, this feeling is here and it is mine, and I'm okay to look at it right now. They can start to have feelings bubbling up, and that's the words Rogers uses, bubbling up inside them. And they may not be fully understood, and may not be wholly accepted by the client, but they do find ways of expressing them right there within the therapy relationship. So an example of this is something like, you know what? I've actually just realized that when I start feeling unsure of myself, I get this strange feeling. It's right over here. It's kind of, it feels like a weight pushing down on my chest, and it just fills me up with all this anxiety. And as I'm speaking about it, I can actually feel it now. There it is. That feeling is right there in the room with you. This client is at stage 5. They're bringing here and now feelings. Of course, there's still the fear of the pain is still there, of embracing these feelings, that fear of total overwhelm from these feelings in the here and now. So you may find that at stage 5, a client may be getting close to something, kind of teetering on the edge, and then pull back slightly, not being able to fully submerge themselves in here and now feelings. And we may notice that there's a reluctance to fully trust the feelings that they're having. So it's kind of a, do I trust this? Because we've just gone from a point where the feelings were not accepted at all, where they were distanced from the person. Now, for the first time, they're accepting and holding this in the here and now. Wow, that's going to be difficult for them to trust that and to be fully integrated in that. So it's understandable that they may teeter and kind of appear, I guess, at stage 4 and 5 at the same time. But as you move through these stages, you'll notice more of an acceptance as they begin to talk more about what they're fully experiencing right now. And it's at this 5th stage that we see those light bulb moments, those realizations, those epiphanies, where the client, I guess, has new insights to their life, to their relationships. So an example of that may be a client presenting with, you know, I've carried this massive resentment for my father because of what he did when I was a child. And I felt so bad about that, about what I've been holding inside. And, you know, he's my father. I shouldn't feel that way. And now looking at it, I think it's okay. It's actually okay for me to be angry about that. I should be angry. You know, I guess I still love him. I still love him. But what he did was wrong, and I'm okay to be angry about that. So more of an acceptance of those feelings inside. We're starting to see the incongruences start to crumble here at this 5th stage. The incongruence would, of course, be I'm feeling a resentment and anger towards my father. I shouldn't feel that way because he's my father. And there's an incongruence. There's a mismatch of the feeling and the emotion and what is happening in the head. And here we're starting to see an acceptance of that. It's starting to become more accepted within self-concept. At stage 5, the client is almost saying, you know, it's okay for me to feel, it's okay for me to have these negative emotions. They are part of who I am. The 6th stage of the 7 stages of process, Rogers described this stage as being very distinctive, often very dramatic. We're talking about life-changing events here, when clients have realizations that stick with them. They're not transient, as we're seeing in 3, as we're seeing in 4, it's unlikely that when a client has these realizations that they will regress back to stage 5. In stage 4 and 5, we may see kind of a crossing over and occasionally moving from 5 back to 4 and then back into 5 again. Here at 6, when we're having these mind, body and emotional, intellectual breakthroughs, we're unlikely to see the client go back again. Their life is changed and the way that they look at the world has changed forever. All feelings are fully experienced in the present moment. It's accurate, it's clear, it is full of meaning. And the client moves from seeing these feelings and these emotions as being a negative, as we've seen before, first of all wanting to avoid them, then seeing them as a negative and not trusting them, into trusting them, knowing they are part of self, and realizing that by fully embracing these feelings, they can see them clearly and they can have power to change who they are because of them. So the feelings, however negative and however scary, are fully accepted into self and then seen as a way to grow and a way to change who they are and change the way they look at the world. The ambiguities, the incongruence, the uncertainties start to click into place. They become crystal clear. And we see the feelings flowing freely and reaching their conclusion. Whereas before, the client may feel the overwhelming feeling at stage 5 and want to go away. What can I do? How can I turn this off? Now we're looking at this client just following that right through to its conclusion, no longer being fearful of those negative feelings. So I guess the client is now seeing these feelings as being enriching in their experience and not to be avoided. And what you may see as a therapist with a client who is at stage 6 is that there's almost a dramatic change where the client starts to look about their own self-care. They start to look at themselves with tenderness. You know, they may speak about, when I look back and I see myself at 10 years old and what I was going through at that time and the pain and everything I've carried for all of those years, that anger at my father, I really look at myself and I think, wow, I want to give myself a hug. I want to hold myself and say, that's okay. This is the client fully embracing themselves and loving themselves. Full acceptance. Carl Rogers says, the curious paradox is only when I truly accept myself as I am do I have the ability to change. And it's quite evident right here at stage 6 in the 7 stages of process. Stage 7 we touch on so briefly because it is unlikely that you will have a client in your therapy room at stage 7. Rogers identified the stage 6 changes, those profound life-shaking experiences that the client may experience to be irreversible. So there's only going to be growth from there. And it is unlikely the client may feel that they need a counselor to do that. It is likely that they will find that growth in their own life as they continue to fully accept themselves, to examine the feelings that they have moment to moment in the here and now. And they will experience self-growth at stage 7. And it's interesting for me, looking at the 7 stages of process, to look at the journey that we've come on from stage 1, where we are unlikely to see a client engaging in therapy, right through to stage 7, where we are unlikely to see a client engaging in therapy. And it is truly a movement from fixity, from rigidity, through gradual loosening of the self-concept, to fluidity, to being a fully functioning person.
Well, that is just so useful. And I'm thinking, just listening to the 7 stages of process, how it's so important that we link theory to practice. And it's one of those pieces of work that we do with clients where the theory actually is so important and so necessary. And as person-centered therapists, we really need to understand it. It's so much a part of not only our journey, but the client's journey.
100%. And having those kind of clues that we've spoken about to kind of see where the client might be at. It just gives us an indication. And I know we speak about person-centered counseling. We don't assess the client as such. There's no formal assessment that we might do, but we're assessing all the time by just looking for those clues. So hopefully that will have been useful for you. And of course, moving on now, this is Ask Ken and Rory. And it's an interesting topic today. We have a question. What is the difference between counselling and psychotherapy? Rory, I'm going to ask you this one. Rory, what is the difference between counselling and psychotherapy?
The difference between counselling and psychotherapy is £40 an hour, Ken.
£40 an hour difference.
I'll get my quotas. I can hear listeners unsubscribing. It's a standard bit of humour that I've used for years, and I think it's a really important topic. There's been quite a vigorous debate in the Facebook page, and our Facebook page, regarding modalities, counselling, and psychotherapy. And I think what I'd say to you, Ken, I don't know if anybody remembers the sketch with Roddy Corbett, where he was stood there and there's someone stood next to him who's a bit taller, and it's all about I know my place. I'm upper class and I look down on him, and he's working class and I look up to him, and all that type of thing.
Oh, Mr. John Cleese was in that.
Mr. John Cleese was in, and maybe what we'll do is we'll put a link in the page to the video, and occasionally, and I'm not saying all the time, when I meet people who've trained in a different modality, they may be at great pains to tell me how their training is better than mine, and it's really, really interesting. And this is my take on it, Ken. The BACP do not distinguish between counselling and psychotherapy.
Yeah,
they say it in their articles. They do not distinguish, but there are differences, and I think it's good to acknowledge them. And acknowledge why there are different modalities of therapy and how it helps.
I agree with you, and I guess we may even say, you know what, I'm a psychotherapist or I'm a counsellor, dependent on what kind of training we've done. So if you go and you study TA, you're likely going to label yourself or say I am a psychotherapist. If you've done person-centered counselling as your training, you may say I'm a counsellor. But here's the thing: in the eyes of the client who is sitting in that room in front of you, it really doesn't matter. It may play a part in them deciding where they want to go in the first place, but once you're in that relationship, it really doesn't matter. You are there in a room with a client to be with them in their pain, and to work with what they are bringing. And the BACP has certainly done some research around which modality of counselling is more successful and has better outcomes. And it tends to point to the fact that the relationship is the most important part of the counselling relationship. But saying that, there are certain presentations that would best suit certain styles or modalities of counselling.
Absolutely. And I think what you're talking about before, Ken, was something called the dodo bird effect. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the dodo bird effect, but I'm going to put a link into the show notes. So if you download the show notes, it'll tell you. But the dodo bird effect was something that's been known for a long time, that the quality of the relationship is the best indicator of a good outcome in therapy. Doesn't matter what modality you're practicing. And recently some work done by Lucy Goldman at Manchester University, a PhD researcher. She was working with psychologists who work with people with very severe mental health issues. And again, the research bore out that the best relationships gave the best outcomes in therapy. But there are presentations where, well, first of all, let's have a look at the difference between counselling and psychotherapy. One of the big differences is training. I was speaking to my good friend Bob Cook over at the Manchester Institute for Psychotherapy, who's a transactional analyst. And his training is something like 650 hours.
Yeah.
The average counselling training is about 400 to 450.
Yeah.
Psychotherapy training tends to work on things like transference, counter-transference, and it's also analytical. So the model itself is practiced. So maybe one of the first things that a TA therapist may do is work out which ego state you're in, which is easy for me. It's permanently in child, and work on the analysis of a client and say, look, this is how you are. That's fine. Some clients might want that. The other thing is some diagnosis from psychiatrists, things like personality disorders, may need a certain approach, a structured approach where the client is said, look, this is how you are, and this is how we may be able to help you fix it. But we have to go through these steps. So we're now talking about CBT therapy as well. You know, if someone comes and they're afraid of flying, it may be that the client only wants to be told, what do I do to stop a fear of flying? So it's always the best fit for a client. It's always the best fit for a client. Psychotherapy is really, really good because it's long. It tends to be long term. Some people could be in therapy for years.
Yeah.
And certainly with issues of historic childhood neglect or abuse, it could be really useful for clients to unpack how their history has impacted on their here and now. So it's about walking back through the timeline and looking at maybe at the decisions being made. So my view is that it's very healthy to have a kind of pluralistic view of therapy. We shouldn't just have one size fits all. We should also respect our fellow therapists. There are some therapies which I just really don't get and won't want to practice, and that's fine because I know that they are practicing in a way that they feel is fine and they don't understand mine. And we should respect that. It's a best fit for client.
I agree 100%, and I think you've explained that so well. And I guess speaking about transactional analysis, where you may be analyzing, maybe working with a diagnosis or looking at the ego states, it's maybe more active and directive work that you will do with the client, and I guess more aligned to the medical model.
Absolutely, Ken. And I think that, you know, I'm going to do a Mapper Monday one day of all the therapies. I've started to do it. It was huge. It's like a map of the world.
Yeah.
But if we think of this, okay, psychoanalysis and transactional analysis really comes from the medical model, in that it's a diagnostic model. And psychiatrists diagnose using DSM, which is the psychiatrist's handbook for diagnosing mental health issues with people, and it links into that. So it's a medical model, and certainly things like Gestalt would say that obviously it's about how we feel in ourselves. It's a whole system model.
Yeah.
So it's a medical model. Person-centered therapy doesn't come from that. Person-centered therapy comes from philosophy. So it's a philosophical model. It's about how we view our world and our place in it. And behavioral models are about science. So they say that if you do this, then the research will tell you that this will happen. And that's things about, you know, as I spoke about in last week's podcast, irrational thinking, irrational fears. They may not be irrational to you. They may feel very rational, but if they're hampering your life. And the other thing is psychosomatic symptoms. I watched a program on the TV about a woman who was a European woman who spoke with an accent of the Indian subcontinent, and she just started to change her accent, and they thought she might have had a stroke, and they said you've not had a stroke, it's psychological. She got very upset because she thought that people would think she's doing it deliberately. That's the sense I got. The fact of the matter is psychological can be very subtle. It can be a very subtle view, and changing our behaviour might have to be a very structured thing. So for presentations such as that, maybe a behavioural model might be more useful. It's a really wide field. We're a very big field that we're in.
And I guess that's why it has been debated for decades and will continue to be debated. And if you look at, again, coming full circle, the BACP, they're not taking a stance on this. They're saying, we don't see any difference. So I guess it's what you choose to call yourself, according to the BACP. But there are those that will say that is not true because it is certain kind of training. Then you may call yourself a psychotherapist. It's a debate, and it's a debate that, again, we encourage you to have with your peers.
Yeah, let's see that. If anybody hears this podcast, which I'm sure they will, I hope they will. Let's why don't we start the debate off? Why don't we start discussing it? Because I think it's something that is a rich scene for us to understand each other's modalities. I get rather worried when people plant themselves firmly in one spot and say, my way is the only way. Yes. I don't acknowledge that. And if a client came to me and had a specific presentation that I know that I couldn't work with, I'd refer them on. Simple as that.
Which I have done many times.
Yeah. And that leads us nicely into ethics, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Wow, what a nice packaging of today, moving from self-actualization through to ethical problem solving, right through those 7 stages of process, bringing in that self-actualization, looking at the difference between counselling and psychotherapy, landing up with ethics again. It's just been fantastic. Rory, I think that we should share the good news. What do you think?
I think we should share the good news. We've been plotting and scheming in the best possible.
Here's the thing: if you like the Counselling Tutor podcast, you're going to love this. Rory and I are getting together for a live presentation. It's going to be done by means of a webinar. And if you've never been to a webinar, don't worry. You just sit in front of your computer, and Rory and I are going to be there, and we're going to bring you some information that we hope that you will find really useful. What are you going to be covering in the webinar, Rory?
Well, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting therapies. It's something that students are always asked to do virtually in every course that I've ever seen. And I'm going to be showing you my Venn diagram, a way of doing it really simply and a really good way of comparing and contrasting. You can take away and make that sometimes a little bit tricky compare and contrast question really, really simple.
Really useful stuff there. Just to get that Venn diagram is a big winner, and it's directly relatable to the assignment work that you're going to be doing. No matter which modality you're studying, you're going to be asked to compare and contrast different models of therapy, so very useful. I'm going to be looking at skills, but I'm going to be looking at skills and how we write them in an assignment and what you can be doing to get better marks with that. I'm going to share some of the tricks and some tips on how you can basically take theory, practice and skills and kind of combine them all together. And again, this is linked to the assignments that you're going to be writing. So hopefully something really useful for you there. And if you are working towards a diploma or higher, you're going to at some stage be asked to write a case study where you're working with a client and you're using your skills and reporting back of what you're seeing within that client. And this will be really, really useful for you for that. So if you're listening to this and you think that's going to be a good fit for you, this very first session that we're having is free to attend, and it's going to be happening on Sunday, the 8th of May. And that's at 7 p.m, that's 7 in the evening, and that is UK time or British summertime that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, that's 2016, because maybe some people will be playing this podcast in the future, and I may be a bit disappointed if they click on the link and they find that they played it in a year's time. Yeah, but it's Sunday the 8th of May 2016. It's a live broadcast, and I'm just really looking forward to seeing people come into the room and kind of get interactive. I think it's going to be great, Kev.
It is going to be great. There is one small drawback, is that the software that we are using has limited seats available. When it's full, it's full. So if you want to join in, what you do is you go to counsellingtutor.com. That's counselling spelt the UK way with 2 L's, counsellingtutor.com/live, because this is live, /LIVE. That's the registration page. You're going to pop in your email, go and get your seat, go and book it right now. And even if you think, hey, I might not be able to be there, if you do register and you're unable to be at the live event, we're going to send you a link to a replay so you won't miss it if you've registered. Show notes for today's episode, you want to head on over to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, episode 12, all the notes, the links, the ethical problem solving matrix. It is all there for you.
Yep. And we feel we know you. You know, we feel that when we see in the Facebook page that we know you, that we hear what you're saying, and it's really important that we do get to know you, because this really is for you and for what you want to do in your practices.
Well, that's it from us. Episode 12. Next week, Episode 13. My father said to me that it's really unlucky to be superstitious. So I'm quite happy that we're going in to episode 13. So until next week, take care.
And stay grounded and stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.